Good to be here on this crisp Wednesday evening. We got the heat turned on a little bit in here, but you don't want to turn the heat up too high, everybody will fall asleep. So hopefully we got it on a good balanced setting so you're not too hot, not too cold. We're still in the period of the retirement where Jesus wants to be alone with his disciples. And even though we're going to be starting in Matthew tonight, there's actually a really helpful verse in Mark that encapsulates this retirement idea. Mark 9:30 and 31. From there they went out and began to go through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know about it, for he was teaching his disciples. So there's a pretty good verse that kind of encapsulates this retirement idea. They're retiring away from the crowds. He wants to spend alone time with his disciples, making sure they understand who he is, his mission, and what we'll see tonight, what true greatness is really all about. And that's going to be our key discussion for this evening. But before we do, let's go to God in prayer. Father in heaven, we praise your name. We thank you so much for your wisdom, for your majesty, Father, and for your teachings about true greatness. Lord, help us to be receptive to the things that we learn tonight from Jesus. And Lord, help us to humble ourselves and to realize that it may be that our culture has perverted our idea of greatness. And help Jesus to restore that for us tonight through his teachings in his word. We're so grateful for your word and the guidance and the moral compass that it provides us so that we can have stability in this life morally, but we can also have peace and freedom from anxiety. And Lord, we can have that hope of heaven. And we long so much to be there with you in that day. Guard us and be with us until that day. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So here is the lesson I really want to drive home tonight. That is that the greatest of all is the one willing to be least of all. And we're going to have an honest conversation tonight about greatness in life. And I believe this is one of the most challenging teachings in Scripture. The hardest, it might be the hardest to understand mentally, but it's also really hard to put into practice. And perhaps especially in our country, though this is definitely not a problem limited to our country. I think the whole world in general, just mankind has always struggled with this concept that we're going to learn. But I wonder, maybe particularly in our country today, if there's an obsession with self. For instance, I'm all about self-help books. I read them a lot. I recommend them to people. And I think there's a lot of people who have a broken sense of self and need healing from that. I think that's a really good thing. But I also realize that if we're not careful, we can swing too far in the other direction and make this life all about self-actualization, and life can just be all about me and what I want and the achievement of my dreams, and it's all about my pursuit of greatness here on the earth. We also live in the selfie generation. I don't know if you guys have seen the commercial recently. I don't remember if it's for the new iPhone or for the new Google Pixel, but the people it's actually kind of humorous, but they're taking video selfies in slow motion of themselves in random places. And anyway, the commercial calls them slowfies. So you have selfies, which is just a picture of yourself. But then you have slowfies, which is actually a slow motion video of yourself doing random things so that you can see all the details of yourself. And then, of course, people go and post those online, and they measure their greatness by the amount of likes that they get on the pictures of themselves. And I understand some of that's just harmless fun, and especially if you have some filters on your phone, that can be fun. But for some, it might be a reflection of their obsession with themselves. Even the corporate world is built around the idea of self moving up the ladder. And every time you climb up another rung of the ladder, the rung that you just left is actually meant to be left behind. So if I start off at a company getting people coffee and running errands, and I get promoted, naturally I now look down on getting coffee for people and running errands as beneath me. I'm greater than that now. I've reached a higher level of self-achievement, and getting coffee for people, that's just one of those entry-level, low-level positions that I'm just too great for now in my position. But Jesus really challenges our concept of greatness. He's going to turn all that stuff on its head. He's going to teach us that true greatness is about humbling ourselves to do the jobs that may appear to be beneath us. Because true greatness is about becoming a slave and becoming a servant to all. True greatness is not about self at all. It's about laying aside any pride we have and stepping down to the lowest rung of the ladder to live our lives in service to others. And of course, Jesus is the greatest example of that, who leaves the highest rung of the ladder possible, being God himself, and humbles himself to the position of a bondservant, even to the point of death on a cross, to save you and me, the lowest of sinners. So let's think together tonight about what real greatness looks like in practical terms. I look forward to getting your feedback on that as we go along. So let's talk about Matthew 17, where Jesus again foretells his death and resurrection. And let's just read these two verses. This is actually the second time Jesus tells them this. But notice verses 22 and 23. While they were gathering together in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day." And they were deeply grieved. Now, let me point out something interesting here, that this is actually taking place after Jesus heals a demon-possessed boy that the disciples could not heal. Remember, they called Jesus down and Jesus says, this kind cannot come out except by prayer and fasting. It seems like the apostles, or the disciples, might have been relying more on their own power than on the power of God. Well, I bring that up because in Luke's account, it's very interesting how he ends that account. After Jesus cast out the demon from that boy, it says in Luke 9, 43 and 44, and they were all amazed at the greatness of God. But while everyone was marveling at all that he was doing, he said to his disciples, "Let these words sink into your ears, for the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men." So the crowds and the disciples, they're amazed at Jesus' greatness, at God's greatness, because in their minds, what Jesus did was what true greatness is all about. It's about having more power and more strength than anyone else. Yet immediately, Jesus turns their attention to the thing that truly makes him great. And that's his willingness to allow himself to be handed over to death for the benefit of others. You know, that's just so far outside the realm of what was expected as a sign of greatness. And even today, that's not what we think of when we think of greatness. I mean, just think back in recent history to like Muhammad Ali. You know, he would often say, "I'm the greatest," right? And he said that, when he said that, what he meant is, I don't lose, right? I float like a butterfly and I sting like a bee. If my mind can conceive it and my heart can believe it, then I can achieve it. It's not bragging if you can back it up. And as Americans, we eat that stuff up. You know, we kind of like it when people are confident and maybe a little bit arrogant. You know, it might rub us the wrong way a little bit, but secretly it inspires us, you know, to want to be great too. And it gives us confidence in people as leaders when they have that kind of confidence that they're exuding. In fact, some of that arrogance and confidence is what drew people to vote for Donald Trump. And the idea that we want to make America great again, right? There was something attractive about his confidence, and we want to make this country great. But Jesus completely redefines greatness. True greatness in Jesus' kingdom is not about winning in this earthly life. It's not about being at the top in this earthly life, or being arrogant or haughty, or being the richest and most powerful in this earthly life. Jesus has true greatness for him is going to come from humbling himself to willingly be treated as the least in society and to lay down his life for other people. Is that our view of greatness? Or has our American culture inverted or perverted the idea of greatness for us? It's a great thing to want to make America great again, but we have to examine our hearts and ask ourselves what we mean by that. What does that mean? If all we think that means is becoming the richest and most powerful country on the planet, we're missing it. We're missing what what true greatness is all about. You know, Mark's account says the disciples didn't understand it, and they were afraid to ask. Matthew says they were deeply grieved even to consider the possibility that their Messiah might be murdered by the religious leaders. And I think many people today still don't understand what Jesus is really teaching here. So let me open it up to you all now. What are some other indicators in our world that we might have a backwards view of greatness? John, I knew you'd have something on this one.
There's a couple of examples. I just remember once, a few years back, visiting. I was up in Detroit. I'm sorry, this was just wrong to me. I mean, because when I show up here in this parking lot, sometimes I see Carol. She parks out there in the back. You know, Dave Rubright parks out there. You know, and he limps in. I pulled into this Church of Christ parking lot, and right up in the very front were the two signs that said, "Preacher Parking."
Oh, no.
At the very front of the building with the sidewalk, and then right behind it was handicap parking.
Oof.
And there was just, I'm sorry. I just, come on, man.
Yeah, that's a good example, John. And we have a new idea for our building renovations, just to let you know, elders.
On the flip side of that, I remember reading once about, venture capitalists and things like that, and when they were going to take a company public, they would go and actually drive the parking lot of these companies to see if their CEOs had preferred parking, and if they didn't, that actually was a good sign for them, because it was like their CEOs weren't kind of like, hey, it's all about me. It was more of, they had kind of a better view of.
Yeah. So there's some backwards thinking that the greater you are, the more privileges you get. When in reality, the greater you are, the more privileges you should look to give others and put them first. And that's just a very backwards concept. Yeah. Anybody else have any other examples? Joe? Oh, sorry, Debbie. Let's see it. Go ahead, Joe, and then Debbie.
Oh, okay. Well, I remember when I first started working at a bank, and it was sort of the opposite of what John saw. I'd only been there a couple of months. I remember the president said, I would happen to be going to lunch, and he said, "So where are we going to lunch, Jim?" And I was like, I don't know. It was just very shocking to me that he saw the value in his employees. I don't think I was particularly that special, but he saw the value.
Yeah.
And I think, we need to strive to be great in making other people great. I mean, that's what he tried to do. Mm-hmm. So just sort of a contrast.
Yeah, that's a really good example of what true greatness should be about. Debbie?
Well, I was kind of playing off of what John said, but I remember there was a program on TV for a while. I don't remember what it's called, but it was actually the bosses went undercover and went to work with the employees. You guys probably know.
I think it's Undercover Boss. I think it's what's called. Yeah.
And that was really cool, because they would have, the bosses would go in and work with the common people undercover, and they would see what they had to put up with, and maybe their short lunch breaks or what kind of bad working conditions or whatever. And it caused them to, at least in that program, to realize, how valuable their employees were, and how they didn't need to be, the cream of the crop, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I worked for Papa John's for like 4 years, and I was so impressed with my general manager. I mean, he was not the manager, he was the general manager. And he was always down there with us on the floor working, and literally he would get on the floor, like on his knees, scrubbing the floors and the things like that he could easily just delegate to somebody else. But he was willing to get down there and roll up his sleeves, and he was just such a great leader and very inspiring because of that. Jack?
Disney had a rule, I don't know if they still have it or not, but I know that they had it back in the 80s, that any manager had to do the job of the people under him at least one day a month, which would remind them of where they came from.
Yeah, really good. So the managers would do the job of one one other person underneath them to remind them, where they came
Some of
from.
those managers out there sweeping trash off the floors.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Well,
Yeah,
even
Chloe.
in shows and movies, so I think the backwards thing can be viewed in like shows and movies. So some shows exalt like a person that doesn't have great qualities, maybe because they're wealthy, or I know there was a newest show on Amazon Prime that actually portrayed superheroes as bad people, and it made you, like think of these people with powers, and it showed like people still rooted for these awful human beings that have power just because they had powers.
Yeah.
And that made them great.
Yeah, really good.
And so that's like.
Yeah, that's a great example of backwards thing. You see it all the time in TV. It's the important things that make you great, or your looks, your social status, things like that. I thought of some other examples, like maybe women who look down on being a stay-at-home mom as less than being a mom who's out in the corporate world making money. And that's just so not true. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the stay-at-home mom is greater necessarily than somebody in the corporate world either, but it's just looking down on something as if it's some menial, unimportant task, when in reality, that staying with your kids, raising your kids, supporting your husband, running the household, that's just one of the greatest, most noblest jobs that you can do. So we need to be careful thinking about that. I think about in worship duties, that maybe some people might think, if I'm not in the spotlight, if I'm not up there leading a prayer, if I'm not leading singing, then I'm not worth anything in God's kingdom. And I just prepare the Lord's Supper. What's the big deal? Oh, that's a huge deal. If we didn't have the Lord's Supper, that'd be a problem, right? You have a very important role there, but you might not be in the spotlight like me standing up here teaching a class. That doesn't mean that you don't have a great role in God's kingdom. So we need to be careful not to be backwards in our thinking, but the greatest of all is the one willing to be least of all. I need to pick up the pace a little bit here. Matthew 17, verse 24. Jesus now pays a half shekel for the temple tax. Now, under the law of Moses, the Jewish men were required to pay this tax every year to help upkeep the temple. And because there were sacrifices being offered at the temple, and the point of the temple was for their atonement, sometimes this was called atonement money. That's actually how Exodus 30 talks about it. Everyone who's numbered from 20 years and older shall give the contribution to the Lord. The rich shall not pay more. The poor shall not pay less than the half shekel when you give the contribution to the Lord to make atonement for yourselves. You shall take the atonement money from the sons of Israel and give it for the service of the tent of meeting. Well, apparently in Jesus' day, one of the traditions that had developed is that the rabbis, if you were kind of certified as an official rabbi, then you got exempt from this tax. So some of these tax collectors are wondering if, Jesus is going to think that he's important enough to exempt himself, even though he may not be officially classified as a rabbi. And impetuous Peter, probably not wanting Jesus to look bad, says, oh yeah, of course he pays it, of course. And Jesus wants Peter to understand that he doesn't actually have to pay this tax. Now, why is that the case? I mean, this is the law of Moses, so why in the world would Jesus not have to pay this tax?
His father is the king.
Yes, because his father is the king. The temple is his father's house. In fact, remember, he says that in John 2:16 when he goes to the temple and he overturns the table and he says, why do you make my father's house a place of business? And remember, Peter, just one chapter before, in Matthew 16:16, made the great confession that Jesus is the Son of the living God. So the question is, do kings make their own children pay taxes to them? No, of course not. And just as an interesting side point, Jesus doesn't bring this up, but I do think it's interesting to mention, Jesus is sinless. He doesn't need to pay money for atonement. He doesn't need the temple to be upkept for his atonement, because he doesn't need atonement. But he pays anyway. Why? He says in verse 27, so that we do not offend them. Go to the sea and throw in a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for you and for me. So it's A half shekel was the payment, so the shekel will cover two people. It was actually about 2 days' wages per person was what that amounted to. But interestingly, Jesus pays this tax anyway, even though he didn't have to, just so that he doesn't cause somebody to stumble in sin. He doesn't want people to look at Jesus and say, well, if he doesn't have to pay the tax, then it must not be that important, and so I'm not going to pay it either. Because it would be wrong for other people not to pay it. Well, here's another example of Jesus showing what true greatness is all about. Because instead of standing up for his rights and his freedom here and making sure everybody knows he doesn't have to pay this tax, he's much more concerned about the impression it'll make on people and that it might actually lead some people to sin against the Lord. You know, one of today's mantras in our society about greatness is to not care at all what other people think of us. And I understand there's some validity to that. We don't want to be, inauthentic and phony and just, try to make people happy. I get that. But some people take it too far and they say, well, I'm just going to live however I want to live, and I don't care how it affects other people. They can just get over it. Well, not so with Christianity. We have to be very careful to consider how our actions will be interpreted by others and whether or not we're emboldening people to sin. In fact, if you turn over just to one chapter, Matthew 18, verse 7, Matthew 18:7, Jesus says, woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks. It is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to that man through whom the stumbling block comes. And we'll talk more about this later. But this whole subject also is going to come up later in 1 Corinthians 8 through 11, in Romans 14 with the subject of meat sacrificed to idols, and then the whole clean and unclean issue. There were some Gentiles who came from a pagan background where meat sold in the marketplace was also used in worship to their false gods. Well, once they became Christians, some of them weren't comfortable eating meat sold in the marketplace because in their mind, that meat was still associated with idol worship. Well, not all the Christians thought that way. Some Christians, they thought, well, yeah, there's no such thing as idols. It's not a big deal to eat that stuff. And so they might invite their brethren to meals and serve them that meat, putting their brethren in a really awkward position to feel pressure to eat meat that they believe is sinful. And so Paul said this in 1 Corinthians 8:13, if food causes my brother to stumble, I'll never eat meat again, so that I will not cause my brother to stumble. And then you had the whole issue with Jews and Gentiles later in Romans, where the Jews, even though Jesus pronounced all foods clean, the Jews for, thousands of years, or I guess 1,500 years at that point, since the giving of the law of Moses, they had this thinking that there were certain foods that were clean and certain foods that were unclean. So when they became a Christian, they still couldn't let that go. They still had a hard time eating those foods that for so long they associated with being unclean. And so the Gentiles didn't have that problem. And they looked at their Jewish brethren like they were being ridiculous. Why should you care what sort of meat you eat? And there was a big problem there, and they were causing their Jewish brethren to stumble. And Paul says in Romans 14, don't tear down the work of God for the sake of food. It is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything by which your brother stumbles. And then he says a few verses later, each of us is to please his neighbor for his good, to his edification, for even Christ did not please himself. He's talking about pleasing them by taking their conscience into consideration, not doing anything to cause them to stumble. That is what true greatness looks like. Now, here's a pretty hard question. I'm curious to see how you guys answer this. You might not be prepared for it. Can you think of any rights that we may need to give up in order to not cause our brethren to stumble in sin? This is a hard question because we don't have necessarily the same scruples that like the Jews and Gentiles had in the first century. But Jen, do you have an example?
Yeah, the way women dress.
Okay, good. Yeah, so some women might have a real strong opinion about the way that women should dress.
And you can stand up and say, I've got the right to dress this way, and that just flies so in the face with what you just said about I'll give up my rights because I don't want to cause somebody else to stumble.
Yeah, that's really good. So there's just so many ways we could go with that. But that's a pretty good example. I'm just throwing this out. This is totally random. I don't think anybody necessarily believes this, but some women might believe it's sinful to wear earrings. And so if that's the case, and you just know that you're going to be with a group of women that thinks it's a sin to wear earrings, then you probably shouldn't wear earrings when you're around them. Even though you have a right to, it's not sinful at all. But if it causes them maybe to be emboldened to think, oh, maybe I'm just blowing this out of proportion, and I can wear that too, then you're causing them to stumble. The earrings, that's probably a horrible example, but Adam and then Chloe.
An example that Bob Waldron used to give is playing cards. If let's say that you know that this brother that you're hanging around, this brother in Christ, has come out of the world of like gambling, and he used to be a big poker player, and he's learned that that's wrong. And so to him, playing cards of any kind, just rook, anything, to him, it's wrong. And if you know that that's his scruple, then you don't invite him over to your house and get out the cards and say, look, it's not a big deal. We're not gambling. We're not playing poker.
Yeah.
You just respect his conscience, and you don't bring out the cards when he's around.
Right. Yeah, that's a great example. I like that. Chloe, did you have one?
Yes, the after communion bread is taken back when it's no longer being used for communion. I know like some people don't think it's not appropriate, and I don't know if they think it's sinful, but they think it's like not appropriate to eat. And so the kids that want to come try it, or the people who want to eat it, may need to give up that right to eat it in the church building. I know like some people think it's okay to take it home and eat it, but at least you have to give up that right then, so you're not offending.
Yeah, that's a really good example. And we look at that and we're like, you really shouldn't believe that about the Lord's Supper bread. Like it's just bread. It's not the actual body of the Lord or something like that. But then you also have passages like this that teach us we need to respect that may be where they're at in their conscience. And if you guys want to talk about it and maybe you can sit down and study that issue together, that's fine. But you don't want to put them in a situation to force them to stumble. Yeah, really good. And honestly, Jesus, by paying this tax, is stepping down from his position of sonship to a position of a stranger. Because he says kings don't collect taxes from their sons, but from strangers. And Jesus is willingly giving up his privileges as son and becoming a stranger in giving money anyway. It's just a remarkable thing to see. It's an odd miracle, admittedly. Go get a fish and pull a shekel out of his mouth. It is one of the oddest miracles for sure. Not 100% sure the point of that. My thinking is that it might just be to emphasize how great Jesus' power really is, and how many privileges he really has as God's son. He can snap his finger and have all the money he wants in the world, but he doesn't pursue his own greatness at all. He only uses that money to benefit other people's souls here. Because true greatness, the greatest of all, is the one willing to be least of all. Well, fitting for our discussion, the 12 now get in a dispute over who will be the greatest. Let's go to Mark 9. I'll read this real quick. Mark 9, verses, let's do 33. They came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he began to question them, "What were you discussing on the way?" But they kept silent, for on the way they had discussed with one another which of them was the greatest. And sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, "If anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all." And taking a child, he set him before them. And taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever receives one child like this in my name receives me. And whoever receives me..." "Whoever receives one child like this in my name receives me. And whoever receives me does not receive me, but him who sent me." Okay. Man, my brain missed that last thing after the comma. I was like, he who receives me does not receive me. Okay. I got it now. So this is just a side point. But if the disciples had made up their own religion, you would think they would just leave this out. This is just an embarrassing conversation, especially after Jesus had just told them, I'm going to be murdered in Jerusalem. And they were deeply saddened by that, but then on the way, they're still talking about who's greatest. Well, they still don't get it. They're still waiting for him to set up this Davidic throne, and they're going to have, one on Jesus' right hand and one on the left. But here's the problem. You have the special 12, but then you also have the special 3, the inner circle. But 3 is kind of an odd number, I mean, if one of us is on Jesus' right hand and the other's on the left, what about the third guy? He's going to be kind of third wheel. So who's the greatest? What is our position going to be in this hierarchy, Jesus? This is really what they're wondering, but they don't tell Jesus that. They don't really ask Jesus. And did you notice when Jesus asked them what they were discussing, they stay silent because they are actually embarrassed to have been caught in their own conversation about this. I wonder if Jesus, if he was here to jump in on our conversations and to ask, what are you discussing? How many times we might just be kind of silent and embarrassed about the things maybe we bicker with each other about, or petty things that we talk about that don't mean much. Well, Jesus tells them the greatest of all will be the servant of all, and he takes a child into his arms, and he teaches them a couple points. One, he says to become like this child, right? You need to be converted if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself as a child, he is the greatest in the kingdom. Why is a child the perfect example for Jesus to use for humility? Okay, yeah, they're innocent, Ryan?
Children rely on someone else for everything.
Yeah, I mean, they are just completely dependent. A child can't be prideful really about anything because they just are totally dependent on everybody for everything. They also had zero status in society. They were literally, I mean, if you have the ladder, the social ladder, I mean, they were just off the ladder. They were so low. They weren't even on it. And I also think about children who are okay with admitting they don't know things and asking questions. And children, they're also kind of shy when you put the spotlight on them. When they get a lot of attention, they hide behind their parent's leg or something like that. They don't really want all that attention. Well, the disciples are being completely the opposite. They want the attention. We want to be great in your kingdom. And Jesus says, you all need to change. You all need to change. And another point that he makes to them about this, not only do they need to be like children, they need to be willing to receive or help and welcome and be hospitable to children, which really by extension in this context, they need to be welcoming and hospitable toward disciples who are humble like children. So in other words, he's trying to teach them that they should help and welcome the lowest of the low in society. Sometimes there's a temptation to only serve and to help and welcome those who are great and in high positions. Why is that the case? Yeah, I mean, they can do things for you in return. I scratch your back, you scratch mine, and you can help me down the road. But when you serve a little child who can't do anything for you in return, that's what true greatness is all about. You serve somebody who is on the lowest of the societal rung. That's where true greatness is. And James rebukes people for the opposite attitude. He says, my brethren, don't hold your faith in our glorious Lord Jesus with an attitude of personal favoritism. For if a man comes into your assembly with a gold ring, dressed in fine clothes, and there also comes in a poor man in dirty clothes, and you pay special attention to the one who's wearing the fine clothes, you say, you sit here in a good place. You say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit down by my footstool. Have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives? Listen, my beloved brethren, did not God choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him? Jesus isn't just saying become the least of all in society, but to be willing to be least of all to the least of all. To be a slave to the slaves, a servant to the poor and the nobodies in society. And when we do that, we are actually serving Jesus. When we receive the lowly and the meek in society, we're receiving Jesus himself, and we're emulating Jesus, who became a bondservant to us, the least of all in society. And it's so ironic that God typically chooses the weak and lowly in society and rejects the great and powerful. So by the disciples asking to be the greatest, they're actually asking God to reject them. They don't know that, but it's the complete opposite that God is looking for. What are some practical ways to make ourselves least of all and servants to all in the kingdom? What do you think about some practical ways to do that in our lives? That's the first bell. We're good. Dave, and then Debbie.
I think it begins with how we look at other people and how we value them. And in Romans 14, verse 15, where you were looking at, he says, "Do not destroy with food for whom Christ died." The problem between the weak and the strong brother in 14 was that they had no compassion for one another. They didn't value the other person as much as they valued themselves.
Yeah.
And Paul just points out, he says, listen, Jesus valued this person that you think so little of as somebody worth dying for.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's the way we look at somebody else.
Yeah, so we need to see everybody as a person Jesus died for. They have tremendous value, no matter where they are in the societal ladder. Debbie?
No, I was just going to say, practically speaking, we can do things for the little neighbor next door and send cards to people that can't respond and things like that that maybe nobody ever knows about. And it's just serving those who can't give back.
Yeah.
Because it's really easy to have the attitude of, oh, if I do something to somebody, they'll give back. But sometimes the people that you can serve the most don't have very much, and they appreciate it so much more than doing stuff for people who have it.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So we go out of our way to serve people who can't serve us back. Randy?
Yeah, Zig Ziglar told a story one time about a man who was of Greek descent. He was building a house. He was up on the scaffolding talking to the workers in Greek. And a salesman came through selling something. And the guy says, "Hey," and the guy just kind of walked on over to the guy's wife and said, "I'm here to see Mr. So-and-so." And she said, "Well, he's the man you just ignored." If we esteem others higher than ourselves, it makes that very easy.
Yeah, really good thought. Sometimes we ignore people, and we should not. Nobody should be ignored.
Yeah, we're always going to be the important person.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, really good thoughts. And I think too about pay attention to things that go off in your mind that's beneath me. If there's some task and you just think that's just beneath me, that's probably the task you need to go and do, just because it might be beneath you in terms of your position in society, but that's the path to greatness, right? Is to lower yourself to that point, to be like your Lord, because it was beneath Jesus, the Son of God, to be on a cross and crucified as a criminal, but he did that for all of us. So, really good. So we're going to have to skip this. I'll just say real quick, the disciples try to forbid someone from casting out demons. Jesus later on, he sends 70 other disciples out to cast out demons. So this is probably just another person that Jesus sent out to cast out demons. Well, when you are thinking about greatness on this earth, everything is a competition. And so John looks at this guy and says, he's not with us. He's not following us. He's not one of the 12. And so he's worried this guy's like a threat to them. And Jesus basically says, you need to honor him because he's a disciple. He's one of these little ones who's doing good work for me. Don't hinder him. And then finally, the seriousness of causing someone to sin. There's 3 important signs that we are very important to God and why you don't want to cause your brethren to sin. Number 1, Jesus says it's better to be drowned in the sea. Have a millstone. This is a millstone hung around your neck, thrown into the ocean than to cause someone to sin. It's like the mob, when they would put your feet in concrete and they'd say, go sleep with the fishes, and they'd throw you off a bridge and you'd sink to the bottom. I mean, it's kind of a disturbing image, but that's the seriousness of what it means to cause somebody to sin, a precious soul to sin. Secondly, angels watch over us. We have angels in heaven. We don't know everything that they do for us, but Hebrews 1:14 says they are ministering spirits sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation. So when we cause people to sin, we're destroying souls that angels are working to preserve. And finally, we are God's precious sheep, and if he loses one, it doesn't matter if he's got 99, he's going to chase that one to the end of the earth. And we need to do the same thing. So it's so important to make sure to give up our rights and to take our brethren into consideration and make sure not to cause one of these precious little ones to stumble. Go ahead, Terry. The greatest of all is the one willing to be least of all. I really appreciate your good comments and attention. Please read through page 93 and the accompanying scriptures for Sunday.